The Beatles play the Ed Sullivan Show. They were known as the Fab Four. These four included John Lennon, who acted as the main leader. He was a guitarist and vocalist. Paul McCartney was also a great leader, and he was a bass guitarist and vocalist. George Harrison, a lead guitarist and vocalist, and Ringo Starr, the drummer. They were all very known, very loved songwriters. Now here's a picture of Abbey Road, which is one of their album titles and song names, and it is one of the most popular photos of the Beatles to date. To begin, John Lennon formed the group The Beatles, which actually started out as the Quarrymen. When he was a child, he was obsessed with Elvis Presley. Elvis was really the reason he got into music in the first place. His role in the Beatles was that he was responsible for developing the band and recruiting its members. He was the president of the group from the beginning. His most famous songs written for the group include Come Together, Ticket to Ride, All You Need Is Love, Strawberry Fields Forever, and A Hard Day's Night. A Hard Day's Night was actually a song written for their movie, which was based off of their lives. Here's a picture of John Lennon in 1964, which was the year that they came to America and played on the Ed Sullivan Show. In 1969, he was photographed on his honeymoon with Yoko Ono. They were protesting peace while sitting on their honeymoon bed. In 1980, John Lennon was assassinated. Paul McCartney was the second member of the band to join. Paul and John were great friends. This is why John finally asked him to join the Quarrymen as a bass guitarist once their former guitarist quit. His role in the Beatles was that he had a solid foundation and he was a constant leader. When John Lennon went crazy later on in the band's years, Paul took over as the main leader. He is really known for all of his famous songs that he wrote, including Band on the Run, Live and Let Die, Yesterday, Hey Jude, Blackbird, and Can't Buy Me Love, all of which are very recognizable. Because of his great achievements and wonderful talent which he acquired, Queen Elizabeth II knighted him Sir Paul McCartney on December 6th of 1996. This was really a motivation for him to keep doing his best at everything that he does. To this day, he's still recording albums as a solo artist. George Harrison was the third to join the band. He was actually the youngest as well. His musical path began because he greatly disliked school. After quite some time following around the Quarrymen to be noticed, Harrison was able to astound the band, mainly Lennon with his flawless guitar skills while traveling on the upper deck of a bus late one night. Because Harrison was so young, Lennon never looked to him for such great talent, but once he played American rock and roll songs on his guitar, there was no doubt that he had to be in the band, and Lennon knew that. He also was a great writer. Many of his songs have been in movies, one of which is Here Comes the Sun, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, I Need You, and Something. To this day, he is still very involved with music and making himself be out there in the musical world. In 2012, he began his app collection for iTunes. Now, Richard Starkey was the last member to join. As he was a child, he spent the majority of his time in the hospital due to chronic pleurisy. Starkey gave up on education to pursue drumming. He began his band career while playing with Rory and the Hurricanes. He gained quite a bit of notice with this group. Upon his recovery from being put back into the hospital, fans all over the world expressed their love for the musician. That was when the Beatles realized that they must make Ringo a permanent member of their group. Since then, he was a greatly loved member by fans and had a tremendous attitude and talent. He was not much of a songwriter, but two of which hold true today and can be recognized, including Octopus's Garden and Don't Pass Me By. After the group split up, Ringo Starr found fame in movies. The path to the Ed Sullivan Show. The Beatles began playing nightclubs in Hamburg, Germany, and Liverpool. They weren't really searching for a manager, but Brian Epstein in 1962 stumbled upon them. Then, Brian Epstein decided that they needed to find a record label, so they went through searching for many, and most turned them down, until finally George Martin signed the Beatles. Later on that year, they released their first single, Love Me Do. Early on, in 1963, their album Please Please Me was released, landing number 1 for 30 weeks on the British charts. In 1964, there was an early release of I Want to Hold Your Hand in America. I Want to Hold Your Hand landed number 1 on the US charts. 1 million copies of the album Please Please Me were sold in America. This was a great accomplishment because, as the Beatles had said before their release in America, that they wanted a number 1 on the charts before they would set path and play live in America. Now, since this happened, the Beatles were off to the US. Ed Sullivan got dibs on having the Beatles air their first ever performance in America. First, Brian Epstein had to set up a financial deal with Ed Sullivan. The Beatles were then to be endorsed $10,000 for 3 consecutive appearances, one every Sunday, starting on February 9th. Only 700 tickets were available for the first show, but 50,000 requests were sent in. Even Ed Sullivan himself had trouble getting tickets. On February 7, 1964, fans lined the streets outside the Plaza Hotel in New York City, trying to catch a glimpse of the Beatles. They had just arrived from England. 2 days later, the show was filmed. During this time, they were hiding out in the hotel from all the fans. Even some fans tried to dress up as maids to get a closer glimpse at the group. The Ed Sullivan Show was kicked off by the Beatles with the song All My Loving Until Then There Was You. The show later ended with 2 more songs, but in between, the Ed Sullivan Show also included acts from numerous other people, such as magicians and so on. In an attempt to try and keep the fans quiet because they were so obsessed with the hairstyles of the Beatles and their supreme talent, Ed Sullivan was quoted as saying, "If you don't keep quiet, I'm going to send for the barber." This was a threat in order for them to be quiet so that the other acts could be respected. The show then ended with I Saw Her Standing There and I Want to Hold Your Hand. This song was the one that made their appearance in America possible. The show aired nights later. 23 million households tuned in. This was a mere 45% of the country's television owners across the nation. To this day, it still holds the record for the most watched TV airing of all time. Here is a link where you can watch the Beatles perform originally on The Ed Sullivan Show. After the show, Newsweek published an issue talking about the Beatles. A critic was quoted as saying, "Visually, they are a nightmare. Tight, dandified Edwardian beatnik suits and great pudding of bowls of hair. Musically, they are a disaster. Guitars and drums slamming out a merciless beat that does away with secondary rhythms, harmony, and melody. Their lyrics are a catastrophe, a preposterous farrago of Valentine card romantic sentiments. The odds are they will fade away, as most adults confidently predict." During this time, any sort of promiscuity was frowned upon by the elder generations, while the younger generations encouraged the racy, exhilarating phenomenon, which is very similar to how our society thinks today. The Beatles playing on the Ed Sullivan Show had a major impact on America. Prior to the Beatles playing on the Ed Sullivan Show, on November 22, 1963, the president at the time, John F. Kennedy, was riding along in a motorcade while campaigning in Dallas. He was assassinated on that day by gunshot. The nation was in a state of worry. They didn't know what to do, but the Beatles came along and boosted happiness and self-confidence once again. The Beatles' invasion brought mop tops, fashion, unforgettable music, and great spirit. Their spirit rose and helped America forget about the bad. The fashion brought the British invasion, which included fashion, rock and roll, America, and England coming together, and a great change. The British invasion brought about rock and roll. After the Beatles' debut in America, more and more British groups found it less intimidating to do the same. From the Beatles came more popular rock and roll groups, such as the infamous Rolling Stones, the Hollies, and The Who. They also brought an upbeat, melodic rhythm and harmonies that changed every aspect of music. Even classical music critiques couldn't help but show admiration, describing them as the greatest composers since Beethoven. The Beatles' invasion introduced many Americans to British fashion. Industries in Britain increased production and sent products overseas. One popular style for women was miniskirts and also Mary Quaint designs. The popular outfit, including black shoes with strips on the top, white socks, and short pleated skirts, were introduced to America by Quaint. Popularity increased all throughout the 60s. Hairstyles greatly changed as men and women alike began to copy the mop tops. The Beatles are an amazing group that changed America forever. To this day, the group is still influential in movies and art.